let's see. Justice and something about karma. Okay. I see that my audio is coming through. Do you mind talking just to make sure my OBS is picking you up? Oh, hold on. It's not picking up. But
I.
I'm glad I caught this now. It makes it easier for me to fix it because I'll know exactly what's causing it. Okay, so window capture. This to this one. Okay, it's capturing that. Now, let me just. Okay. My microphone's picking you up, but the. Okay. Okay, I'll change it to PC audio. Okay, try talking now. I opened up a. Okay, let's see here. Change this to. Okay, try one more time.
Test, test, test.
Hello, hello. Okay, it looks like your audio is coming through nice. So we are live and everything is perfect. Awesome.
All right, sounds good. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is start the recording. And we're going to start the recording in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Civil Rhetoric.
How's it
I am
going?
actually really excited for this episode. I'm going to be reintroducing one of my favorite guests here, Joy D. King, the virtual tuber who streams. And when it comes to discussing a topic, whether it's something that's really big, we're quite capable of hammering it down and making it a little bit more palatable and digestible. So today's discussion is actually going to be about something that's been kind of twisting my head around for the last week and a half or so. We're going to be discussing justice, and it's something I'm very much looking forward to because the idea and the mentality that I came into when I began the research on this topic versus where I'm at now are basically night and day. So this should be a fun one. Joy, if you wouldn't mind, introduce yourself, let people know where they can find you. I know we're where we're live right now on your stream as well. So
Yes.
let people know where they can find you.
Yes, I am Joey D. King. I'm live on Twitch most days of the week now, about 3 or 4 times a week, as well as on YouTube. So if you want Twitch integration, that's Joey D. King on Twitch. If you don't like ads, you can also catch my stream on YouTube as well. Thank you for the instructions. I am a virtual streamer, but today I'm going to be a virtual streamer and a podcaster, and we'll be talking about justice.
Nice, and I'm looking forward to it. So I guess let's dive right into it because I understand like when we start talking about something, it can go for as long as it needs to, and I understand we're up against a wall today. So let's definitely do it.
Yeah, so I would like to start with, I guess, defining justice. This is always what I like to do to make sure that, we're talking about the same thing. And then, of course, we can go on for tangents and things like that. But so what I have here is how I would define justice. And then I'd like to know how you define justice. And then hopefully we can come to a consensus that seems as if it's more correct than where we started with. But in my opinion, there's two forms of justice. And I distinguish these forms based on, well, I dubbed them a name. I'm not great at dubbing names, but I call them artificial justice and non-artificial justice. Artificial justice, in my opinion, is essentially, well, it's essentially things like Hammurabi's Code or like the standard justice system we see now in the Western world current year. Non-artificial justice, I see, would be things like karma, things that are like passively retributory. Oftentimes I see them as being this sort of zero sum. Karma is like the most common type of non-artificial justice. Now, obviously I call them artificial and non-artificial because artificial justice, the punishment has to be doled out by other people, right? It's proactively retributory, right? It's not something that's done because, well, someone's going to come, hey, Jason, how you doing? And TR, thank you for joining us. But yes, non-artificial justice as opposed to artificial justice, non-artificial, it's passively retributory. Like some force will come and even out the score, right? It'll be zero sum, so to say. So that's how I define justice in those two forms.
That's interesting. When I started thinking about like what I would use as a term to define justice, what I came across just myself and through research was kind of it being a balancing act
Mm-hmm.
and having the world and everything, in my opinion, exist on a balancing act to where the scales need to be balanced in order, for things to progress forward positively.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of how I define justice. It's basically adding balance and order to the world. That was
Turn
my
his volume up a
beginning
little bit
definition of
more.
it. Now that I think about it and I look at it now, to me, it's less of a it's more of a concept that I believe humanity is kind of labeled the world in order to have a better understanding of it and to better, come to grips with the reality of the situation that we
Mhm.
have been living in reality. But for me, I would say at its basis form, it's going to be based on order and, balancing of the scales. But in terms of like the actuality of it existing in the world, that's the one thing that I've begun to question ever since researching this.
Thanks, got it.
Okay, I see. I see. Um, so in your own words, how would you say justice is interpreted nowadays?
I would say that it's interpreted through
Sorry,
emotions
Caps.
and feeling and a lack of understanding. This is just in general, not in regards to an individual person on an individual basis. But it does seem like to me that when it comes to seeking justice or gaining justice, we kind of forget the fact that if you're going to play cops and robbers, the cops need to be the good guys who stay cops versus becoming the robbers to catch the robbers, because then that is not the existence of justice, because that's you just playing by the rules of the other person. So now I would say a lot of it is just beholden to people's emotions, especially when it comes to, social media, its influence, and kind of how it's steered and how we're engineered now, versus having terms of like natural justice, for want of a better term.
I see. I see. So, in terms of justice being led by feelings, that actually is an interesting tangent because there was one topic I really wanted to discuss back when we were talking about power, but must have slipped my mind or wasn't in my notes, and that was the popularity of, I guess, because like back when we discussed about power, one thing I want to talk about was how a lot of people like to base their morals around power. The morality of might is right, power is right, and in many ways, because they have a word for it. It's if I remember, it's popular ethics, where what is right is what's most popular, right? Like if the majority say so, then say so is right. And I really wanted to talk about that back in power, but I guess we could talk about it a little bit here in justice because if justice is what everyone says is right, that is a very hard force to fight. But in my opinion, I don't think that's right. That's just what is popular, which is again hard to combat. It's hard to fight everyone if you're in the minority, even if you're right.
I would agree. The one thing that that does kind of enable, especially, and I do agree that this applies to power as well, it's just the idea that whatever the group says and whatever the group agrees on, kind of like even the creation of words and, the color yellow being called the color yellow versus the color green. It's basically the group agreeing that, for the most part, this is what it is, whether it is that or not. And when it applies to something like justice, I think it does kind of lead towards the popular opinion or the idea of might is right, because if you're in the group and the group is in agreement with you, then you kind of have said power. And if you're outside of the group and you disagree with the group thought or group think or whatever the group defines that thing as, you're left on the outside and you have to you're forced to either accept it or to separate from said group.
Right, exactly. And unfortunately, because we do not live in a perfect world, we oftentimes have to choose between what's convenient and what's right. It's a very difficult balancing act. Like as moral as I would like to be, if someone put a gun up to my head and say, talk shit about your friends. Unfortunately, I'm not going to take the bullet. As much as I disdain talking about people behind their back, practically speaking, it's just not worth it. And that's a very extreme example, but everything in life is a balancing act between what's right and doing what's practical. And if you just completely ignore that, then I'd say you're on a very quick path towards being an unethical person.
Unethical, ostracized, and
Hmm.
honestly just alone. I think that's kind of the only way you can exist outside of ethics, is if you exist outside of, the group. You would have to basically be completely solo and on your own, and in which case you would have the ability to stand by and live by your own personal code of ethics. And in which case, at that point, I mean, then I guess justice is balanced in that scenario, because there are no outside factors that are influencing it one way or the other.
I actually have a very interesting way on how I convince people to do the right thing, or at least what I think is doing the right thing. Oftentimes, I'll see people where they have very strong opinions or morals about something, and they will oftentimes like to hammer that into other people, right, by like just beating them over the head with it. You got to do this, you got to believe that, right? If you're not doing this, then you're that or the other. I tend to find that's not very effective. I tend to find that that actually causes people to do the opposite of what you want them to do or what you want them to believe. Now, instead of playing some weird like reverse psychology game, what I tend to notice works most effectively, in my opinion, is to just live your life as morally as you can, and people will come to follow by observing your life. They'll see how, I guess, content you are with living your life, even if your morals make life harder, right? Just by going out there, being yourself, and being confident in what you believe in, even if like you don't know everything. I tend to see that turns people around much better than beating them over the head with your morals or whatever you think is right or whatever you think you want people to believe.
How do you think that that applies to our current society with the constant advertising that we kind of face and, using things such as the algorithm, which kind of forces you, down a thought hole or, the rabbit hole, as people like to say.
Or echo
Um,
chambers, possibly. That's definitely a very
correct.
common thing. So, unfortunately, I think a lot of people don't think for themselves, which is very unfortunate. Of course, like, even though I say that, there's sometimes I don't think for myself, right? Like, if I'm in a completely lost subject, something I know absolutely nothing about, right? Like, if I wanted to go into cartography, right? And, I know nothing about cartography, right? I would go towards other people that know about cartography, or even like institutions or companies that know a lot about cartography. Like, can you teach me? Can you tell me what you know? What do I need to buy? What do I need to do? What do I need to think? And then with all that information, right, I will try to come up with, I will go back into the think for myself aspect. But rather than playing devil's advocate, unfortunately, because I don't think a lot of people think for themselves, they sort of go into sort of autopilot, that they're very subjective towards, this kind of propaganda, like, social media, echo chambers, very popular groups that they might identify with. And if I remember, we talked about identity before, so this is a nice little tie in there. Things that they identify with, that they want to identify stronger with, and then they end up in these echo chambers, they end up being influenced, and they end up thinking things that they might not have thought otherwise because someone just told them to think it.
I would agree, but your approach to it versus what I would assume is a general approach, or just even the general approach that I kind of see from what's around me, is you're taking an active, role in learning about something like cartography so that you can then process it and approach it the way that you see best. Most people, they don't even take the time to research, they don't take the time to look into it. They see one or two sources for some really colorful background or some really fun, easy to digest message. And they're like, okay, well, that is it.
Mhm.
And that's the way the world is. And this is the truth. And anything outside of this is wrong and evil.
Yeah.
That's kind of what because I recently I've just been looking into different religions and the formations of it and how it connects to older gods and things of that nature. And that research, from what I've noticed, is kind of going back to that might is right kind of way of looking at things. That's pretty much been, the majority of humanity's history. It's typically a smaller group of humans that tend to think for themselves and outside of what things are, and they can lead forth to being catalysts to help change things. But in the most case, the masses, they tend to just follow orders and like to be herded, for one of a better term.
Mhm.
And I think that that's been, I guess, highlighted nowadays. I mean, they even not they, but who's they? But the term influencer.
Right.
The term influencer is in the name, and we're like, "Oh, this is my favorite influencer. I like the way that this person influences me." And, even to, okay, my phone has an update. I know I could read through this 2 or 3 pages, but let me scroll really quickly to the bottom and click accept without any idea of what we just accepted. I
Exactly.
just
So,
yeah, and yeah, it's crazy to me.
so this is actually a really good way to tie us back into justice, because there was one subject I'd like to talk about concerning justice, which again could be its own podcast in and of itself. But this is the concept of trust. Um, Now, the way I see trust is I see trust as essentially a societal currency. It can be doled out, and it's sort of very mercantile trust, in my opinion. And a lot of people, the way I see it is a lot of people don't think for themselves because they can live with giving out a lot of trust to these institutions and these corporations and these influencers and stuff, and not have to worry about dying or anything like that, right? Like, if you trust your friend and he says, oh, go mess with that spider, you mess with the spider and you die, well, suddenly now giving out trust is not so right. It's not so, you can't hand it out so freely anymore. But since we're in a very protected society, at least in current location, people can dole out trust very easily and not have to worry about consequences or things like that. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing per se. I'm just saying that's what causes a lot of these sort of people that can be very much manipulated and why there's so many of them. But that's not a bad thing. People can learn to think for themselves down the line. I just don't want to beat it over their heads and be like, think for yourself because I'm telling you to do it. That'd be very
That
ironic.
defeats the purpose at that point, you know.
Exactly. But anyway, so the thing with trust is people seem to give trust in things that not necessarily have to give trust. The way I see it is, at least in my opinion, trust should be given out based on things like, competency, things like that, right? Things that you can like actually, for lack of a better term, put money on, right? But people oftentimes give trust in things like, I don't know, I like the guy, or they're in the same identity as me, right? We're both in the same fan club or something like that. Like if I was to pick a heart surgeon, right? If I needed heart surgery, I would pick a heart surgeon with the best competency. I wouldn't pick a heart surgeon because they watch the same anime as me, you know?
Agreed.
And some people would. Some people, well, no, that's an extreme. But some people put trust in things that have nothing to do with competency or anything like that, right? They're like, oh, I mean, yeah, the guy is competent, but this other guy, he's confident. I'll put trust in confidence instead of competency. And that, of course, will tie us back into fairness, which will tie us back into justice. All these is very multifaceted, but fairness and trust and justice, these are all things that will later down the line come to explain each other, and then we can see the relationships between trust and justice and fairness.
I would agree. One thing I'd actually like to kind of step backwards towards that you mentioned earlier
Mm-hmm.
was about the presumed, I guess, safety that we have in today's society and how people are more willing to basically trust their lives and their well-being to like these faceless entities, where there would
Mm-hmm.
be a corporation or just getting on the freeway and driving because you're trusting that that person that's taking this other, 1,000 pound plus machine isn't gonna just decide to turn a little bit to the left and wipe out an entire family. So
Exactly.
we do have these ideas of presumed safety that we have now. It's even very evident when you're looking at something like a First Amendment audit, which is a person going to a public area, like a post office, and recording and filming, and the reactions that people tend to have, which typically are negative, because they don't feel like being filmed. When the First Amendment auditor points out the fact that they're in the post office and there's a camera there, or you drove here in a Tesla and
Mm-hmm.
that's recording everyone, they're like, well, that's okay. I'm okay with these things, filming me 24/7 because I trust them
Mm-hmm.
or I feel more comfortable with them. So I'll give up that freedom for that versus the individual person I can see, touch, and feel. I'd rather some faceless corporation have access to my image. And I think it's that level of trust that's kind of blind, that we don't actually take the time to understand what we are trusting or what we are opening or what box we're kind of getting into. We just assume safety because we've been, repeatedly told this is what's safe, this is what's okay, whether or not it is safe or okay. Even down to the food that we consume now, even down to like the content that we consume now. The more popular, streamers, the more popular podcasts, they're going to talk about something that's relatively close to brain rot, in my opinion, versus
Mm-hmm.
someone who has a rather open discussion about something that is as tangible or intangible as justice. And that to me is kind of the scary part, because it's almost as if the the free thinkers in society are either being outcast or they're completely just being, labeled something that they're not. Kind of like with the election coming up. And I know this is relatively inflammatory, but everyone believes that we only have two options when there are other people that are running,
Right.
and there's also a very viable candidate, in RFK.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a person. and the other people running wouldn't even have an opportunity to stand on stage to debate because we're being told that there are only two parties that have an opportunity of winning. So these are the only two people we need to focus on and worry about, which is unfortunate, in my opinion.
Right. I mean, so I would say, to be fair, there's always infinite options, right? There's always the chance that, the dollar falls and, complete anarchy breaks out, in which case, the third option would be like, total destruction of society as we know it and stuff like that, in which case, the leader is just whoever has the biggest stick at that point. But I would say that I don't really see popularity anymore as, now I say anymore because there was one time when I began streaming where, I would consider popularity to be a measure of success. But yeah, the larger podcasters out there and the larger virtual streamers and influencers out there, they definitely are popular and they definitely follow a certain rule. Basically, they follow the rule of what's popular. And if they do what's popular, that makes them more popular, and then that feeds back into itself, right? Unfortunately, what's popular now? Have you ever read The Crowd? I think it was by, I want to say Jean Jerome, but I feel like that was an artist. No,
I
no,
have
no, no. It
not.
was no, it was a French author actually. The Crowd,
Right.
by it was a French author during the French Revolution, actually. So obviously you could see where they got the inspiration for The Crowd because French Revolution was a very interesting time in history where the masses had a lot of influence over how society was going. But essentially, it's The Crowd, the study of the popular mind, um, by Gustave Le Bon, right? That's right. So in the book The Crowd, Gustave explains to us that the masses essentially follow a sort of chain rule, and that they are essentially as moral as the least moral person there. Right. So if you take any individual person there, any individual person in a crowd, you take them out of the crowd and you speak to them one on one, you'll probably notice that they are a very moral person, a very standard person, right? They'll tell you what's good, they'll tell you what's bad, they'll tell you their likes, they'll tell you what they will do, what they wouldn't do. But if you put them in a crowd, suddenly they become as amoral as the most amoral person there. They might do things that they would never do outside of that environment. So we're kind of seeing the same kind of thing here with more popular influencers where essentially if I take any individual person from their crowd, right, the people watching their podcast, right, like I oftentimes watch things that are very popular, that are very mainstream, but if you took me out of that scenario and had a chat with me like 1v1, kind of like what we're having here, right, I might be a bit more vocal on my opinion. Obviously I won't agree with everything in the video, but I might just watch it just to watch it. So I think we're sort of seeing this crowd effect that we've seen, that Le Bon has seen, what we're seeing on a virtual level, where essentially people don't even have to be near each other to be considered part of a crowd, right? They could be virtually very distant, like in podcasts and virtual streamers and things like that, but they still have the same effects as a crowd. You know,
Of
they might
course.
watch
I
things or
mean,
appreciate or even say things online that they might never have said otherwise if you isolated them from the crowd.
I would agree. I think that's very evident when you look at, some of the more excuse me, the controversial spaces that are, communities online, whether it be someone that's like extremely pro masculine. I wouldn't even say pro masculine. They're like more, and I don't even want to use toxic. They're to the far right of masculinity, for want of a better term. And a lot are the far right of femininity or womanhood. And you have these groups of people who are saying some extremely crazy things that
Mm-hmm.
I'm pretty sure that they don't actually believe. But when they're in this group, in order to get the pat on the back from the rest of the group and to actually be held up in said group, you're going to say something more inflammatory than the previous thing said because you want to stand out in said group. And I do agree that if you sit down one on one and talk to somebody, versus, having that mob mentality, I would agree that I think most people can sit down and come to some form of agreement or acceptance, especially when it applies to something like truth or something like love or something, as simple as justice. It's just, I feel like we're becoming more and more disconnected because of the fact that everything now does kind of leave us tethered to our groups, whether it's the form of attire that we wear, the music we listen to, or even if it's, the podcast or the streamers that we watch, we kind of become so enmeshed in it that we lose our own individuality, and then we become a part of that echo chamber, and we forget the fact that, wait a minute, just because I believe one thing over here doesn't mean I need to believe it all. I can also disagree with this. But it's like we kind of just get so caught up into that, the hype of that crowd.
Exactly. So I kind of want to tie us back a bit to justice. I feel like we went a bit off tangent, but this is great stuff. This is stuff that
Yeah.
in and of itself is kind of its own podcast. Like we did talk about power, but I could see us doing a whole podcast on just the identity of power, mixing
Yeah.
both the podcast of identity and power. Being like, what's might is right, what's popular is right. If everyone says it's right, then it's right. That could be in and of its own thing. But to tie us back to justice, let's talk a bit more about. Okay, so I mentioned karma earlier, and I called karma essentially a non-artificial justice. So I'd like your opinions on karma, essentially.
To me, I would say that karma is a little bit more of I do believe it's an inactive form. It's kind of like the breathing process.
Mhm.
You don't have to tell yourself to breathe. Your body does it in order to basically not expire. And
Mhm.
I think that when you apply that, to something like karma, it's something that's bigger than the singular person. And it's something that is more along the lines of like the universe in itself correcting itself.
Mhm.
It would be, as a movie example, would be like I Am Legend.
Mhm.
20 years down the line in I Am Legend, nature reclaimed cities, nature reclaimed these areas. And that I would see as, the karma of the world kind of balancing itself out. Even with diseases and things along those lines that maybe call a part of the population because it's moving towards, again, finding balance because there's too much of one thing or whatever that one thing is causing too much damage to the area. That's why I believe that we have things such as climate change and things like that. I believe that is the karma, which is the result of the actions that we have taken. So actually, yeah, action or reaction. I think karma is the reaction to the action that exists outside of us or any singular or group of people, making sure that that takes place.
Interesting. Because, okay, completely honest, when I went into this, like as I was researching, I was very much dead set on the belief that I don't think karma exists. But I never thought of it in terms of a sort of to include things and forces outside of humanity, like nature and things like that. But, just to like humor what I wrote down here, just to like see, because now I'm kind of in doubt about whether karma exists. Because when I was writing this, I was like, yeah, I don't think karma exists based on what I'm looking at here. But from what I wrote, right, from like all of my notes here, so, I defined karma as a non artificial justice because it's zero sum, right? It has this whole like it balances out. Whereas, like, the justice system or Hammurabi's code doesn't necessarily claim that it always is a balance out, right? Like, if you go out and you murder someone, it's not like the justice. I mean, Hammurabi's code might, but like, it's not like the justice system will murder you in retaliation because of that. But with karma, it's sort of like, oh, it all balances out. It's all zero sum, right? In the end, the universe will balance out all the good and all the bad. The good will be rewarded and the bad will be punished and things like that. But the way I saw it was that I didn't think that a zero sum justice could exist like karma because I look at serial killers and I say I don't think serial killers can ever be balanced out. If you've killed more than one person, there's almost nothing that could be done to you to sort of equate to that, right?
Hey, you can't be killed twice.
You can't be killed twice, right? So if they can't be zero summed, then I don't think karma would exist. But I guess if I look at it from a universal perspective, right? Like, well, you kill multiple people, but the way it punishes you is that it kind of punishes maybe all of humanity or maybe all of the world or maybe even all of the universe if we want to make it that sort of expansive. So I might have to rethink on my opinions on karma, but that was my opinions actually before we started talking about this podcast. Not that it comes up too often; it just shows up on non-artificial justice. But that was essentially what I was going to go into. I was going to be like, well, I don't think karma exists. And even though I see examples of what people might call karmic justice, right? Like, oh, you did this bad thing, and so this other bad thing happened to you, right? Like, how can you explain that? In my opinion, the way I see, like, okay, if you like steal something, and then something bad happens to you in, in not because of like the justice system, but because some sort of karmic interference or something like that, or even the justice system, the way I saw it is I think that happened because they got sloppy, essentially, right? Like people do bad things, so they might be more prone to doing more bad things unless they, go out, change their attitude, and perhaps, ask for forgiveness for the people they hurt, right? But that's a very small percentage of people who actually like turn around in and of their own volition and, make good on the bad that they've done. But if you don't do that, right? If you like go out, you do something bad, you're more prone to doing bad things, and then you keep doing it to the point where you don't really kind of care, right? You get sloppy with it. And if you get sloppy with it enough, eventually something's going to happen to you, right? Either you get caught, or you mess with the wrong one, or, you just hurt yourself in the process of doing these things. And then that, I think, people confuse with karmic justice. Like, oh, they got their comeuppance. But no, they actually just kind of got sloppy. They just sort of kept doing it and doing it and doing it. And either through, by just numbers alone, or because they weren't as diligent with trying to get away with it, they got caught. But I guess, again, I'm going to have to rethink my opinions on karma. I guess if I consider the whole universe as being sort of on karmic scales, there's no way I can actually necessarily doubt that until, right? Because like I can doubt serial killers being a zero sum, right? I can doubt that, but it's harder for me to doubt the whole universe. So I'm gonna have to reconsider that. So I would say I'm now in doubt about karma.
Interesting. Based
Mhm.
on the explanation I just heard from you,
Mhm.
it actually led me more towards, well, I guess karma does exist.
Mhm.
And I do believe it's based on my perspective because I see more of a clockwork type of universe and a clockwork type of world.
I
I
see.
do, I do believe that there is order that exists within all the chaos, and that, universally, let's use the example of a serial killer.
Mhm.
For a serial killer, let's say they get caught on their seventh, eighth, ninth, 10th, third person. Um, Zero sum, I don't think you can kill them more than once, so
Mhm.
you couldn't do a life for a life in exchange. However, them getting caught because they do one thing multiple times, and if you do it multiple times, eventually you'll leave some type of evidence, some type of DNA that will trace back towards you. And if that does happen and occur, at that point in time, that, could be interpreted as that is the karma of their bad deeds catching up to them. Whether it be, they walk outside and get hit by a bus because that guy ran a red light, or because, the law enforcement actually finally is able to narrow down who the perpetrator is because of mistakes or hints that they left during said crime. And
Mhm.
to me, I would define that as karma, basically the pendulum swinging back towards preventing that person from, doing more damage to the world or to the structure of the universe because they are an anomaly, so to speak.
Mhm. I see. Maybe it's because I only see punishment as being very retributory. Um, but I'm thinking of it in another sense, in that if you remember in our discussion about identity, we talked about the possibility that there are people out there that have identities more valuable than their own life, right? It could be even several times more valuable than their own life, which is quite the crazy idea to imagine. But if that was the case, right? So we'll go back to serial killer. You have the serial killer, and you have their life, their singular life, which cannot be worth more than the number of people that they've killed, obviously, because you can't kill them multiple times. So even if you take the serial killer's life away from them, that won't balance out everyone's life. But say you take their identity, right? Whether it's now, I imagine if you're a serial killer, your identity might be, I don't want to like judge or be like, oh, I know what it's like or whatever. But if you're a serial killer, your identity, you might identify with something like, I don't know, life doesn't matter. I don't want to say nihilism per se, but you might have this identity that it's okay to murder, or you might have this identity that everyone murders, or you might have some twisted sense of judgment and morals as to what you identify as being why you do it, or some sort of justification for it, or what have you. If you attack their identity, I could see that as possibly, right? Like you could be like, oh, well, you're a serial killer, but you're going to get swift justice, and you're going to pay for what you did, but we're not going to like, remove your organs and punish you weirdly and harshly and do strange and unusual things to you because you're a serial killer. We're going to attack your identity of justice. let's say. Now, whether or not that can actually be zero sum, I'm going to have to think about it some more. But if you can attack their identity, you can possibly get more retribution from them than you would if you just took their life, if that makes sense.
I would agree. It's actually, are you familiar with like Ghost Rider
Oh,
comics?
yeah, I'm familiar with the Ghost Rider. Marvel is very cool. Thus, the
Very cool
Penitent
character.
Stare.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And that's kind of where I was going to go because it's taking all of said, trauma and experience that the people that they perpetrated these actions on, and it's giving it back to them. And at that point in time, to someone who is, let's say, a serial killer, or even if someone just steals a pack of gum, if they understand what their actions truly entail versus they just wanted a pack of gum so they took it, or they felt like life is less, another person's life is less worthy than their own, kind of the way we do with animals or with hunting. At that point, do you tie back the justice? Is that the justice in it? Is them understanding or realizing or coming to the conclusion that what they did was wrong and they need to deal and live with that? Is that, the karmic balance of it? Is that the thing that actually is the retribution because of the fact that it's something they can't get away from through something as simple as death?
Right. So I guess I use serial killer as an example, partly because of its, how extreme it is, but also like anything less than murder can be, right, like it can be taken back to the perpetrator, right? So if someone steals a pack of gum, then they have to be okay with people stealing gum from them, because, well, if they're not, then they would be essentially a hypocrite. And if they're a hypocrite, then they don't really have any values that they can hold up to their own. They have to sort of live with that hypocrisy, being like, oh, I'm okay with stealing gum, but I'm not okay with people stealing my gum. Even if the universe comes and takes it from you, gum gone. The universe says, you stole gum, gum taken from you, gone. Right? So I would say living as a hypocrite is, in many ways, it's sort of its own punishment. Now, I hear this a lot, and I know it's sort of a lame thing to say. I know a lot of people might think this is pretty lame. And there's probably a better way to say it, but have you ever heard the saying, if you punch someone, you're actually punching yourself?
Yeah, I've heard it.
Yeah, I see that trashed online a lot, and I get it. It sounds super lame, right? It could, again, to tie this back to masculinity, it could just be because, we don't see that as a very positive masculine thing. Like, oh, if you punch someone, you're actually punching yourself. I can see why it's trashed online, but at its core, I think it has some very sound logic to it. I just don't think it's presented in a way that's very digestible. I think it's presented in a way that, in current year, it sounds very lame. But essentially, what it's saying is that doing bad is a punishment in and of itself. And if you take that logic, you flip it on its head, technically doing good should be a reward in and of itself. We say that a lot, and I don't really see people being like, oh, that's lame. I mean, maybe people say it, but the consensus, the heuristic is that that's not a lame thing to say. Not that it matters whether it's lame, but I just like to see the patterns in what people see, because, you could say, doing good is its own reward, right? That sounds like a fairly um, that sounds like a fairly good thing to say, right? Like people would agree with that. But if you look at the reverse, people don't really like that. Doing bad is its own punishment. Essentially, if you punch someone, you're punching yourself. So why is it that doing good as its own reward is so well regarded, but doing bad as its own punishment is not?
Well, and I think that that actually ties justice, identity, and just freedom altogether.
Mm-hmm.
It's if you present someone, oh, if you do good, that is its own reward. That makes them feel good. That makes them feel warm and fuzzy.
Mm-hmm.
However, as human beings, we're not all good. We're not all bad. We are a blend of the two. If you take the things that they like to keep hidden, the things that, we like to kind of, recluse away from the rest of the world, and you put that mirror up and you have to look at it, well, at that point in time, it's like, well, I need to really deal with this. Like, if I go steal gum or if I punch someone in the face, am I punching myself? It's like, in a way, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
because I am saying that it's okay to be in a society where you can physically assault another person,
Mm-hmm.
whether or not that other person is the one that hits you, or you're living in fear of someone hitting you because you did it. So you understand other people feel this way and they might do it. it in itself, it is the thing that's actually happening, but it is a more difficult path to traverse because if you're trying to go from, being a person who's good and just and you actually understand that the actions that you take affect everyone else around you just like everyone else's actions affect you as well, that would then give you the responsibility of being a better human being and a better person
Hmm.
because not just because you get some, immediate reward or even any imminent reward. It's just the idea that it's introducing more positivity into the world, which means it increases the chances for more positivity to exist versus the latter.
I
But
see.
that's work. That's a lot of work. That's getting up and working out in the morning.
It
That's,
is.
if you see someone stealing a package, that's saying, "Hey, don't do that." That's putting yourself in harm's way.
Hmm.
That's living a life of meaning, in my opinion. That's living a life worth living.
Yes. So, okay, I actually have two things to say about that. One is directly related to what you just said, and the second one is actually a tangent that circles back. But let me talk about the one that's related right to you. So it's actually kind of a story of mine. So I am in the line of work where I deal with a lot of people that have done very sort of petty things, right? And one thing I've noticed is that a lot of thieves will be the first person to say that there are a lot of thieves out there. Right? Like, so I encountered this guy, right? And he steals a lot of things, right? Very but I also noticed that they have the opinion that the world is full of thieves, right? Like they will be the first person to point out, oh, that person steals stuff or everyone steals stuff. And then I come to realize that's actually very common in thieves. And not just thieves, but really any, because I extended that thinking and kind of thought like, well, actually a lot of people kind of think that the world thinks their kind of way, right? So if you steal something and you're okay with stealing, right? Or rather, even if you don't even think about it, you are, um, you're, what's the phrase I'm thinking of? You're obstructing your worldview. Your worldview has now become warped. Because if you're okay with being a thief, you might say that the world is full of thieves. You start seeing thieves where they don't exist. Now, outside of my work, I don't see many thieves at all, right? I don't think anything has really ever been stolen from me from anyone I know. So maybe it's my view that's warped, but the way I see it is that if you do bad, your worldview gets warped. Or at least that's one way to sort of deal with being okay with doing these bad things. It's like, well, everyone does it. So you start seeing them everywhere. And it's very much related to what you do. So, back to the whole if you punch someone, you're punching yourself. Well, that's kind of the same thing. Like if you steal from someone, you're actually stealing from yourself. And that you're obstructing your worldview. Your worldview would have been clearer if you hadn't done bad. Right?
Agreed. It's I forgot where I heard this, but the breakdown of why our society kind of stays stuck and it takes so long for these large momentum shifts is even at like our workplace, for example. You're rarely going to come across someone that does, if they, don't work for themselves, of course, but if they work for someone else, you're rarely going to come across someone who says, you know what, I get paid exactly the amount I deserve.
Mm.
I feel like I'm treated fairly, and I feel like the world is a wonderful place. Typically, you're gonna find people who are gonna bash where they work, or they're gonna bash the amount of money they make, or they're gonna give you some type of grievance. If that is something that everyone in that work environment experiences and goes through, it would make more sense for them to group up and, let's say, not go to work for a day
Hmm.
because they can't fire everyone because
Right.
then the company would fail.
Right. Exactly.
However, because we're not just, or because we have these fears, or we lack the ability to identify with, with actual goodness and actual justice, we're going to think that our coworkers are going to show up and you'll be the only one not showing up. So that kind of makes you just continue to show up and accept what you get versus actually actively doing something and changing said scenario. And I think that that kind of ties in closely with it because of the fact that we just we tend to passively exist to get from one, location to another versus actively existing because again, the amount of risk that that entails. Because if you're in a world where everything around you is negative, then that's your worldview. You're gonna, because you're afraid that you wouldn't do it, you'd, chicken out for whatever reason. So you're gonna say, well, that other person will too. So there is no active stance that's being taken. You just kind of passively allow things to go
Very
through
interesting.
you. And
Oh,
I mean,
thanks,
to
CR.
me, that's kind of where I got to where, like, well, injustice can't really exist, because for that mentality, for that, just society to exist, for that to exist, that exists absent of justice, because it's not like all the good guys won. Although Norm Macdonald has a hilarious joke where he says, I'm really glad that that worked out that way. All the good guys seem to have won throughout history.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's yeah, just a head scratcher to say the least.
hmm So I like to go back to my second point, being on why it's more okay. So our initial, well, not our initial, but the thing we were talking about before was why it is more popular to say doing good is its own reward, and it's less popular to say doing bad is its own punishment, even though it's the same thing, two sides of the same coin, yet one side seems to be more popular than the other. Now, I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but this is why I think society has accepted, or at least Western society in current year, current location, has accepted the idea that doing good is its own reward, but doing bad shouldn't be its own punishment. Someone else should dole out that punishment, right? Like it needs to be like okay, imagine someone steals and like, oh, you stole, your punishment is that you stole and you have to live in a world that is now more biased because you did bad. Obviously that would never be accepted in like current world, current year. But why? Even though you can say, oh, you did good, your reward is you did good, there you go. My theory, money. I think it's because of money.
Yeah.
Because it costs money to reward people for doing good, right? And if anything, because of now, I'm very familiar with the privatization of prisons in, again, current year, current location, being the Western world 2024. Because of the privatization of prisons, it's actually very profitable to keep people in prison. It's very profitable to like not only not let bad be its own punishment, but to further punish bad deeds by imprisoning people. So I think it's all because of money. Like in a perfect world, well, again, in a perfect world, there would be no bad essentially, but in a more perfect world, doing good would be its own reward, genuinely, and doing bad would be its own punishment, genuinely. But because of money, it's profit. Like it doesn't cost money because, like, imagine having to pay people for doing good. That would be very costly. Whereas like to punish people, it's incentivized because, well, you get to keep them prisoner essentially, and if you get to keep them prisoner, well, you get to make money off them. So I think, again, I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but because of money, that's why it's okay to say doing good is its own reward, but also why you can't, well, not you can't say, but rather why it's unpopular to say doing bad is its own punishment.
Well, I mean, if you actually like open that and go a little bit deeper, I think it's one and the same, because of the fact that if doing bad is its own punishment, you should have to deal with the results of said punishment, whether
Exactly.
that be imprisonment or, that be, you live in a neighborhood where people also steal from you.
Mm-hmm.
The unfortunate, portion of that is there is no middle ground. There is no, well, you did bad, and now through taking these steps, this actual work, you can be rehabilitated to help prevent others from doing bad and also prevent yourself from doing bad. These privatized prison systems, there's no actual rehabilitation that takes place. And because there's no rehabilitation that takes place, although that's what that system is supposed to be designed for, that in itself means that the system is doing bad. And if we don't take the time to point out the fact that, hey, the system is doing bad, but we'll focus on a couple of systems or a couple of programs that has worked and look at the success of, these ex-prisoners, we're not actually dealing with the problem at its root. We're not actually looking to solve anything. I believe, like, you're right 100%. We're just finding ways to squeeze money out. And I'm a
Exactly.
person that's 100% okay with squeezing money out, but there
Capitalism.
is a way
I
that you
understand
can
that.
squeeze money out without, you know, allowing the bad to continue.
Right.
You know, the mistreatment of prisoners, the mistreatment of, you know, people that live in lower income communities. These are things that don't have to persist, and they wouldn't stop the money that's being made. It's just it's easier to just
It's more convenient.
yeah, of course.
So that's now again, you know, if we take this idea and we move forward with it, the way I see it is I can see it getting better. I can see it getting better. I do have hope that it gets better. But the way I see it getting better is if rehabilitation actually starts getting cheaper than it is now, right? The cheaper rehabilitation gets and the more effective it gets over time, of course, right? Over time with better techniques, better technology, the cheaper and more effective it gets, it will eventually, in my opinion, outperform monetarily just keeping people prisoner. Because if people aren't prisoners, they can go out and get taxed. And if they make a lot of money, they can get taxed a lot. But you can't do that if you're in a privatized prison, obviously. So if they can be rehabilitated at a very low cost with potential to be taxed very much, then I could see how that could be a future where this sort of phenomenon doesn't necessarily happen. And in which case, I could start to see people more accept the idea that, you know, doing bad is its own punishment as equal as doing good is its own reward.
I wish I could agree. Like,
Hopefully, I
really
could be
wish I
hopeful
could
about
agree.
it, but
I'm like, I think that that is a very hopeful opinion in a hopeful way. I wish I could agree. I recently did an episode with an attorney, Michael Fryer,
Mhm.
and he deals a lot with the homelessness epidemic. And when you look at how much it cost, I believe it was, and I'm going to butcher his numbers, but it was like $8,000 a day
Wow.
to have someone basically be homeless and on a bunch of programs that they're not taking advantage of versus paying a small group, because there are groups that do this, you know, $2,000 a day to house and help rehabilitate this person. I do believe it is less expensive to rehabilitate folks. It's just not as easy to control people if they're not continually committing crimes or they're not continually subscribing to whatever said popular opinion is, and that kind of forces them to stay in that box or that little round hole versus actually maybe they're triangular, maybe they're square, maybe there's something else that basically prevents the individuality, and it also prevents the advancement, you know, of society as a whole versus for a small, you know, group of people. Because, you know, as humans we always feel like there's not enough to go around, although this world could be boundless. But I mean, it's I guess I just have a more pessimistic look on humanity than you do.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, you know, I wouldn't bet $1,000 that that is the future we're going to see within the next 10 years, realistically speaking. But I always hold out hope that it might happen, you know? That's like, I wouldn't bet my life that it won't happen. Let's just say that.
Agreed. I would hope. I mean, it would take something like an Independence Day. Like, it'd have to be something that would force people to have to consider the group because they would not be able to survive without the group.
Or
And
like
I
an
think
alien
that's
invasion or something like that.
yeah, something huge, like something that forces people to get together. Because I think about like social media and just the connectivity we have now and the amount of good that can be used for. Like the fact that doctors from all across the world don't communicate and research and study things together is a major reason why a lot of diseases, a lot of, you know, bacterial infections, a lot of viruses are allowed to exist because there's so many people with so many different bits of information that's just fragmented versus it actually coming together. And there are groups that do this. It's just versus the, you know, they are the outlier versus the rule. And because of that, progress just becomes much, much slower
That
for the group as a whole, so to speak.
Yeah, that is definitely a shame. And again, that's definitely because of, I guess, the privatization of, I guess, information nowadays, right?
Yeah.
Where like you have all of these very genius people that could come together and give out this information to the public for free that would probably help inspire future generations of researchers that can make compound progress on top of their progress. But because either they can't afford to see that progress because it's all privatized, then we're left with either convenience or money. And, unfortunately, we went the route of money.
Yes.
And there's nothing wrong with money. It's just like when it comes at the cost of, you know, collective human development, you got to kind of wonder what's even the point of money if it's starting to hold us back.
Agreed. I mean that can even be seen like in terms of if someone believes in climate change versus not believes in climate change, to each their own. But if you're in your own home and you just decide to pour crap, whatever refuse, rubbish, trash, you just pour it in one corner. Eventually, it starts to spill over into the rest of the corner.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's not changing anything, in the household as a whole. But the fact is that corner is getting worse and it is getting bigger. And that eventually, does affect the home. And that's kind of how I look at things like climate change. Whether or not it exists or not, we can't say that what we're doing is actually beneficial for the world as a whole, whether it be overfishing, whether it be the fact that we make new cars every year versus repairing the ones that already exist. And
Getting a new phone every year. That's a big lead in the Colton cobalt mining, which I have my own spiel about. Not a lot of people know about the cobalt and Colton mining. It's a damn shame, but it just is.
children,
It is
children,
in mines.
children.
I've not upgraded my phone since then. It is an old iPhone X, and I
And
still haven't upgraded it.
but the crazy part is, you get money and then it introduces greed. The crazy part is that you and let's say 5% of the world who decide that they want to take that active stance because they just don't want to be a part of that because that it's just not okay.
Mm-hmm.
That 5% then becomes ostracized, demonized by the popular group because now you're just a conspiracy theorist. Now you're being kooky, or you'll get made fun of because you still have an iPhone 10
Exactly.
or
I'm
the
not the
phone
cool guy
itself.
with the new phone, right?
Yeah.
It
And I mean,
happens.
it's
It definitely
it's
happens.
yeah, it's supremely frustrating. I had that happen to me because I go to the office sometimes. I went into the office and had a coworker point out the fact that I have an older iPhone. I don't even know what it is. It might be an 11 or 12, but it was because the one previously broke.
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, "Oh, you still have this old phone?" And like, I'm not even trying to toot my own horn here, but I'm like, I know you live paycheck to paycheck. You're struggling to make rent, and it's like I have a house. I have zero bills. Like, how is this even a means of something for us to discuss? Like, how is me having a phone make me less than or more than, versus someone who does have the newest version of the phone?
Mm-hmm.
And it's like priorities are out of place. And again, that's what led me to down that line of just like, man, can it exist in a world that is driven by something outside of the natural balance of things, so to speak?
I see. Honestly, I don't think I would ever have the answer whether justice truly exists or not, whether there is artificial or non-artificial, or really if there's artificial justice that will ever reach the levels of non-artificial justice being a zero sum, until I've seen like the end of the universe, until I've seen how it all comes to an end. And that's a scary thought, like what is at the end of the universe and things like that. I have my own spiel about like how I think the whole universe ends or whatever, but um let's tie into a subject that I've been dying to talk about connected to justice, that being fairness. We talked about trust, we talked about justice, but fairness is extremely important to justice, and I kind of want to talk about fairness.
Oh, let's do it. Like, I 100% on board with that.
So, how would you define fairness?
It actually shares the definition of justice to me.
Mm-hmm.
It's an equivalent exchange and it's balance.
Okay.
So let's say I'm 200 pounds, another person is 100 pounds, and we only have 3 apples to eat.
Mm-hmm.
Would it be fair that the 100-pound person gets the same amount of apple that I get? Or is that in itself unfair because they don't require as much nutrition based on their size and stature? To me, fairness would be, well, maybe they get 1 apple, I get 2, because that would be the equivalency that exists in that.
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of how I look at fairness.
I see. So I define fairness strictly on its objectivity, in being as objective as possible in a judgment. And of course, one could argue objectivity doesn't exist. The closest we could get is universal subjectivity. But I guess if I view objectivity as not a goal, but something you want to emulate, then I would say be as objective as possible, as objective as one can possibly be. And in terms of that fairness, unfortunately, because we do not live in a more perfect world, fairness is oftentimes limited by our convenience. And if we were to tie this back to freedom, you could actually exchange the word freedom. You could exchange the word convenience with positive freedom. Now, if you remember, and if anyone watching this doesn't remember, but with positive freedom is essentially the freedoms that we are allowed to have now. It's essentially our conveniences, right? Like, for example, this might be relatable with some people, but a lot of people that might be watching this have the positive freedom to order like 20 McNuggets at 3 a.m. while watching Netflix. That's something you wouldn't have had like 50 years ago. And 50 years from now, we might, assuming there's no end of world type scenario, 50 years from now, we're probably going to have even more positive freedom than we had before. This, of course, is in conjunction to negative freedom being, of course, closer to inalienable rights. But we're not talking about negative freedom. We're talking about positive freedom here. So, again, in my opinion, I think fairness in this imperfect world we're in is limited by our convenience or our positive freedom. The more positive freedom we have, the more fairness we can allow. And, of course, there's the other way around, right? The less positive freedom that a community has, the less fairness it can afford, let's say.
Agreed. I mean, if you just take a look at our society now, uh, especially here in the Western world, there are haves and have-nots. Is
Mhm.
that fair? Maybe, because maybe it's based on, how hard you are willing to work or how smart you are willing to work. But if someone starts, let's say it's a race and everyone starts at a starting line, but some folks in the race have an opportunity to start 100 meters away from you and it's a 200-meter dash. Well, is that fair? Is it fair that if an apple grows on a tree, a taller person has more access to it? But I do agree the objectivity of that, just the idea that, well, maybe that person provides a boost and now everyone gets more apples.
Mhm.
I I think that's where something occurred in our development, and just maybe this is a natural state of things, a natural state of being, where we overconsume, and overconsumption, I believe, is the enemy towards actual fairness being allowed to exist in our society.
Interesting. I never thought of it from that angle. So that's obviously very stoic, right? Like being able to live essentially like not within your means, but being able to live with the minimum amount of like external sources that you really don't need. They're just unnecessary luxuries, right? These are essentially living without one's positive freedoms, living without those McNuggets at 3 a.m. while binge watching movies on Netflix, because it is unnecessary. Um, so I never thought about that in terms of fueling unfairness, actually. I never thought of unfairness as a topic. So that's definitely something I would like to expand upon more, the concept of unfairness and excess in unfairness.
Agreed. And it's hand in hand again with something like justice. If a person goes to court and they can afford a good attorney, they can
Hmm.
afford a good paid attorney, that increases their ability to get a positive verdict,
Hmm.
regardless of not if what they did was wrong or not. you
Hmm.
know, that in itself, like that kind of disintegrates any type of justice or fairness that can be allowed to exist because it isn't an apples to apples comparison. It's can you afford to pay your way out of it, so to speak.
I see. I see. Yeah. So in terms of convenience or in terms of positive freedom and fairness, I kind of want to take it a step further from what I said in that it's not just that fairness. Okay, so if positive freedom is the currency, it's not so much that you can buy as much fairness as you have positive freedom. I think it's actually kind of cyclical. It's sort of a feeding into itself kind of thing, in that like fairness feeds into positive freedom and positive freedom feeds into fairness, being in the sense that many institutions we have rely a lot on freedom, not just justice, but things like education, right? Things like the military, things like even like currency relies on fairness. Without fairness, currency wouldn't really have much value because it wouldn't be fair. If if their dollar's worth more than my dollar, I'm not going to use dollars anymore because it's not fair. So a lot of institutions we have rely on fairness. So if things aren't fair, those institutions fall apart, right? We see this in things like corrupt governments, where its currency might not even be worth anything because it's so corrupt, it's so unfair. Why would you trade in a currency that isn't fair at all, right? Like, it's just, it could be inflated, it could be that they've pumped out too much money, and it's an unfair currency, or why would you study at an institution that's unfair, right? Makes it lose its utility, right? So if these institutions need fairness, then that means fairness feeds into these institutions, and we get positive freedom from these institutions existing. So that would mean that positive freedom is now fueling positive freedom is now fueling fairness, and fairness is fueling positive freedom back into itself. So it's not just that positive freedom affords us fairness, it's also fairness gives us back more positive freedom. It's a cycle.
I for the most part agree. For the most part, I definitely do agree with that. And I'm not sure where it occurs to where that line then begins to be blurred. It's as if I agree that, like, having that, positive freedom, that does exist and that does feed into the fairness, but at some point during that transaction, it becomes, I don't want to use the word unfair, but I would say it becomes unbalanced. Whether it be because, currency as an example, currency not being backed by a physical, tangible thing has the ability to be manipulated, kind of like what's going on in China. They have been manipulating their currency for quite some time,
Their
and now
GDP as
it's
well,
leading.
from what I understand. Yeah.
Oh yes,
Yep.
very much so, and that leads to rapid inflation. That
Mm.
leads to food becoming less affordable, less accessible, and it also leads to the the degradation of a society.
Mhm.
And we're seeing it in real time kind of all across the world, and I'm not sure where that occurred. Like, if we look at food here, uh, food like a McDonald's.
Right.
McDonald's, you can get that 20 McNuggets and you can have them delivered, but is it really fair that those 20 McNuggets cost like $12 to $15 now when it only costs $3 to make, manufacture, and pay the employees and keep the lights on? It's like, is that fairness or is that exploitation at that point? Like, I'm not sure where that occurs though, like where it goes from, well, if they're willing to pay for it, then if they consider it to be fair, then I guess that is a fair, because a good deal is relative. Yeah, that's one of the sticky wickets for me, so to speak.
Yeah, it's okay. Honestly, the concept of, well, okay, so this is definitely multifaceted, right? So we're talking about consent, right? We're talking about essentially. Oh, thank you for the raid in it TV. We're just in the middle of our podcast on justice. Thanks for coming. But yeah, this
If you have any ideas or perceptions, was it any TV you mentioned?
in it TV, I just got rated.
Any TV. Yeah, if there's anything you'd like to present, I'm 100% open for it. I
Oh yeah.
think the implementation of like multiple minds, especially on a subject that it's not a subject you can just grab and hold on. It's like trying to hold on to water. It kind of just slips through your fingers. If there's anything you'd like to share or say, please post it. I'd be very into that.
Yes, we're open to any suggestions, any comments, anything really, any inputs. But one topic about fairness that you touched upon, which is very related, would be capacity or consent, right? So capacity or decisional capacity is essentially in case anyone doesn't know, is the ability to tell right from wrong and the ability to make your own decisions, right? So a person loses capacity if they're incapacitated, if they're drunk, right, under the influence, too old, too young, mentally impaired. All these things may reduce a person's capacity to make decisions. And it's not like a 1-2 on off. It's not binary. It's not like you have capacity and then you don't have capacity. It's very much a spectrum, right? Like you could drink one beer and still have capacity, right? But 2 beers, 3 beers, suddenly your capacity is diminishing, right? It's not like you have it and then you don't have it. It's like you have it before you started drinking, and then you start drinking. Now you're losing it and you're losing it and you're losing it. Beer's a great example because, some things like, being too old or too young is a very much on off kind of thing, right? It's very much sort of, you've just sort of lost, or like, getting knocked out, right? It's just you had capacity before you knocked out, and in an instant you lost it. It's very much sort of on-off binary. But in general, decisional capacity is a spectrum. It's something that you have it, and then you start losing it and losing it and losing it. The more that these external factors come and take it away from you. Now, in terms of how we relate decisional capacity to fairness and justice, it is that, well, this is sort of a sticky situation being, if a person doesn't have capacity, how do we treat them in terms of the justice system, right? Like, oh, I was drunk when I did it. That's right. Like all these factors sort of come into when justice is applied, right? Whether it is punishment or a reward, a person's capacity is very much a determining factor, right? Like if someone did something but they were a baby, obviously, you can't punish them. They don't have any decisional capacity.
No, I would agree. I mean, I have an 11th-month-old now, and it's funny now he's like starting to pick up and drop stuff on me, and like he'll knee me in the jaw or something like that. It's like, yeah, you would want to get upset about it, you would want to be bothered about it, but you understand that that person had no control over what they did and actually no idea of what they did. I do think that when someone's very young or even very old and compromised through something like dementia or along those
Right.
lines, I think at that point, they kind of relinquish the they relinquish their part in, what is an equivalent exchange, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
However, I think when you introduce things like drugs or alcohol, I think that that's an active participation because we all know that if you drink enough, you get drunk
Mm-hmm. Right.
and you do begin to lose capacity. So I think that allowing that to occur is kind of accepting that. Just like we know that if we eat fast food every day, that we're going to gain weight and we're not going to feel good.
Right.
But, a lot of people eat fast food every day because they might not have an opportunity to cook, or it's just quicker, it's more convenient. So for those things, I think that people are still responsible for that, whether it involve alcohol, like if you're a drunk driver, you hit a car and you kill a family, uh, you deserve to be under the full enforcement of the law, just as if you were sober, in my opinion, and you did it on purpose.
I see. Yeah. Now, I was of that mindset. Like I would have definitely agreed with that. Um, Probably maybe about 2 or 3 years ago, but I came under, well, this new information came to me, and that is the concept of addiction. In that, when a person is addicted to something, it very much changes their brain chemistry, right? Like, if a person's addicted to something, they're almost sort of forced into rehabilitation because not only do they lack the decisional capacity because of the drugs, but the addiction itself has also changed their brain, right? They've essentially become this kind of like an infant where someone has to take care of them because their brain has changed so much because of addiction that you could take a perfectly rational being, and if they're addicted to something, right, their brain has been changed so much that they just can no longer be called that perfectly rational being anymore, regardless of what they're addicted, well, maybe not regardless of what they're addicted to, but from the major addictions you see that like change brain chemistry, I would say that they can be accountable for starting it, assuming that, of course, they know, right? Like, if you start taking drugs when you're like 12 for whatever unfortunate reason, you can't blame them for that. But if you're an adult and you start taking hard drugs, you start like, even though it's, better that you could get addicted and stuff like that, or even just getting addicted to alcohol, I could say you could be accountable for that. But when you become addicted and your brain chemistry starts changing, I would say you sort of devolve back into a being that needs someone else to take care of them and make decisions for them because the addiction has changed them so much.
See, I agree with that.
Hmm.
I do agree with that. I do believe that it leads to a potentially slippery slope
Exactly.
because those are the times it's like, well, this person is addicted to, let's say, alcohol
Right.
or to a drug. Then they need to forcibly be placed in, some type of rehabilitation program because the ultimate result is if someone drinks and drives, let's say they've done it for 20 years, maybe on the 21st year is when they're going to end up causing someone else to experience a very massive tragedy.
Hmm.
So that should be curbed. That should be stopped. It's kind of like a Minority Report and having pre-crime, like you
Hmm.
stop the crime before it happens.
Right.
The like that slippery slope that I see that kind of gets in the way of something like justice, gets in the way of something like freedom is the fact, well, if someone does choose to do so, if someone does choose to, use what is the drug that's killing everybody right now? Fentanyl.
Fentanyl,
They,
yes.
like it's not laced in something else, like they just like fentanyl, or they like the rapper cough syrup, the codeine syrup drink, or they like, crack cocaine. If that's something that they like and they choose to do so, then to me, it's like, well, you kind of got to let them do their thing. I do think that they need to have access to other avenues. But then again, that would take accountability on both that individual person as well as the society as a whole by saying, you know what, this is an unhealthy addiction, despite the fact that it might lead to more money, for a select group. I think that this problem needs to be addressed and taken care of to help that person, which in turn helps society. But
Hmm.
that again would be taking the accountability of understanding that if you punch someone, you're also punching yourself.
Exactly. We tie it back to that. And yeah, I think it's definitely a very difficult topic because again, kind of like I said, decisional capacity is a spectrum, right? You have it, all other things unconsidered, assuming there isn't some sort of mental illness or some sort of external factor, you have decisional capacity. And then as a spectrum, you can slowly lose it. But also, addiction is also a spectrum, right? Like the
Correct.
point that you become addicted. So we have these two spectrums that we cannot entirely pinpoint. Like, we cannot entirely objectively pinpoint, at least with the technology we have now, to objectively say, oh, you've reached addiction. This is the last straw, and now you've reached addiction. Or this is the last straw, and now you've lost decisional capacity. You kind of just have to play it by heuristic, like
Yes.
when someone has reached that point where they cannot make decisions on themselves, whether it's because of a mental illness or whether it's because of an addiction. Mental illness especially gets very tricky because I imagine it's probably a person that is very much cared for by their caretakers. So, you know, decisional when do you say this person now has lost all their decisional capacity? Of course, we have experts that can assess this, but again, it's it's very much a tricky spectrum. And now we have two spectrums, both addiction and decisional capacity, that are both sort of hand in hand in here. You got to know when they're addicted. You got to know when they've lost decisional capacity. And that ties into justice. That definitely ties into justice because a lot of tragedies happen because of, addiction or loss of decisional capacity. And we're just not at that like as a society, we're just not at that level where I can say we can objectively determine both addiction and loss of decisional capacity with, let's say, 100% accuracy or even like 99% accuracy.
That I would agree with. I mean, because we're all individuals, maybe one beer makes someone else, intoxicated, or one beer doesn't do that to me. And it's like, well, if you tell that person I drink one beer a day, they're gonna assume it's like, well, one beer gets me drunk, so this person's an alcoholic.
Mm-hmm.
That's a yeah, it's like a weird, it would have to be case by case,
It
and
would.
that's something that we don't do in a society. I mean, hell,
It's
like,
tough.
yeah, we have t-shirts. T-shirts are small, medium, large, and then it goes, the spectrum. But it's like not every large t-shirt is the same size of large.
Yeah.
It's really more of a medium, in between small and medium, but we don't do that. We just say, well, this is a large person should be about this big, table should be about this tall because the average height is this. And that's just the easier way of doing it versus, a case by case scenario.
Yeah. I actually have a real world example here. So my grandfather, back when he was still alive, he suffered from dementia. And we oftentimes as a family had to but even though, I say he suffered from dementia, and that was actually that whole side of the family that was fairly common on that side of the family. But, he would have these moments where he would be very lucid and it kind of comes and goes. It got worse over time, but he would have these moments where, he kind of was very lucid and he kind of like acted very, I don't want to say normal, but he acted like he didn't have dementia essentially. So we kind of had to play it by ear, like, how was he feeling today? What was the situation, right? There were moments where like, at family gatherings, do we keep him near, the pool table? Do we keep him near, the glass table? Do we keep him here? We had to make decisions for him, but sometimes it seemed like he could almost make decisions for himself. Of course, that deteriorated over time, unfortunately, but it was very much more of an art than a science. It was very much of, how are we feeling it's holding up today? Then, we know he doesn't have capacity, or we know he does or he doesn't.
Yeah, or where that line is, like where does
Exactly.
the capacity exists for, being present versus, not. And I mean, it's such a scary thing because not even the person experiencing it is capable of doing so.
Exactly.
They just kind of come in and out of it, kind of like a werewolf. It's like at one point you're a person in the full moon and you went out and you killed a whole bunch of livestock.
Yeah.
You had no control over that. Like that's and I think that is one of the things that as a free society, that if there was justice, because that's something that can affect anyone, if there was the existence of justice in the world, there would be a more targeted, attack on trying to make corrections for things such as that because it doesn't just occur in America, it occurs all over the world. And
Exactly.
there has to be similarities and just like patterns that exist within it. So if we did share more information and we were a little bit more fair about things, it could be something that could be, aggressively addressed. And I mean, there are societies that, talk about having ways of reversing it. And there are foods that we can eat. There are not vitamins, but foods we can eat that will provide us the proper nutrition that can help us combat these things. But because there's not as much money in that, that's information that doesn't get told to us. Instead, it gets kind of, ostracized or considered mumbo jumbo, for
Mm.
want of a better term.
Yeah. Like, okay, that kind of hits home because I started early. Like one part of my family suffers from obesity, the other part suffers from dementia and things like that. So, I kind of started early with like my memory and my weight and things like that. Like over the last year, I've lost approximately 52 pounds. So,
Awesome.
yeah, I was overweight. And of course, I've been taking like now, we're both mycologists here, or at least I consider myself an amateur mycologist. I've been taking my lion head mushroom supplements. I feel like they've been very helpful because I very much do not want to get dementia, but at the same time, let's kind of depersonalize this for me and go back to justice and reward and punishment. And that when you're taking care, hey Faith, I most appreciate the lurk. If you're taking care of someone, right? Like, okay, so you have someone who does not have decisional capacity and they are in your care. If they do something or something happens to them, it would be the caretaker's fault for what happened, right? Like if someone's baby goes out, gets lost, gets injured, or injures somebody, it would be the parents' fault because they are in charge of them because the baby doesn't have any decisional capacity, right? But
Correct.
I could say I was in, even though I don't have children myself, I could say I was in a very much similar situation with my grandfather, where if anything happened to him and I was in charge of him, it would be my fault if he did anything or anything happened to him. And I didn't have a problem with that. Like I was anxious, definitely, but I knew that that was my responsibility, right? I knew that that is just what justice would be because I am the person in charge of this person who doesn't have decisional capacity at the time, right? And that is just kind of how we as an imperfect society deal with capacity and justice, right? That's just how it is.
You see, I think we do it on an individual basis,
Hmm.
but I don't think we do it as a society
Okay, yeah, I
because,
see what you mean.
yeah, like if we did it as a society, society would take a more active role in, trying to curb homelessness or trying to curb the fact that, some people can't even eat. I
Hmm.
think that on an individual basis, and I'll use my own example with like my son. Predominantly, my wife does all the child rearing. I'm active. I'm there and I play. I do all that stuff, but she's the one that does all the research because she doesn't work. That's like I'm a sole income for the household, so I have to
Hmm.
focus on getting money for the household, and for her, like that's her wheelhouse. So I basically whatever she says about that goes. And whenever I have him by myself, like, there's that anxiety of, like, I don't wanna be the one he gets hurt with.
Yeah.
I don't want her to come back and he's got a new knot on his head because he fell off of something, and I'm always worried about that. But that is me taking an active role and accepting that responsibility versus, wanting to point it or hand it off to someone else. And I think individually we do that. And I think as a society, though, like that's the one thing that we do lack. And I think if we did do that, we'd have something closer to justice. We'd have something closer to fairness. We'd have the ability to look at a situation based on a case by case scenario and apply, punishment or praise.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Um, I mean, there are examples of where we as a like, for my specific example, that's, individual, very local. But there are some examples of where the caretaker of a person who lacks decisional capacity as a society is dealt with. Um, but it's very, well, not rare. It's actually very specific. In the case of a child where, if the baby does anything, if baby gets lost, baby gets injured, societally speaking, the artificial justice is to punish the caretakers, right? The guardians of the baby. But other than that, I would say I agree with you. Other than the example of children, then pretty much everything else is just, local justice, essentially. Just the localized justice, the sort of, how everyone is feeling, not us all as a society coming together to decide that these are the rules.
I'd agree. It's the one thing I thought about when you said it was, well, then what happens when you couple it with, let's say the parent has an addiction to alcohol or drugs,
Mm.
and it is the reason why they were not capable of, taking care of or assuming responsibility for said minor. Does that then absolve them of that? Or is it the fact that they did it still a crime and that's what's wrong with it? It's like this odd sliding scale.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the trickier examples because again, we actually have the decisional capacity of two entities being the child and the parent now. So now we have three spectrums we have to deal with. I was already lost with two, but three spectrums is quite the sticky situation. And these things happen, so they have to be resolved somehow. We can't just be like, "Oh, it's a difficult situation." And I imagine because we are in an imperfect world that oftentimes these things aren't handled properly. In fact, I would probably bet most times they aren't handled very properly. But again, we are limited by our positive freedom. We are limited by our imperfections in these scenarios, and they, unfortunately, these things happen, and they're really tough to call. It's a very difficult decision to make.
I'd agree. The one thing I would disagree on is I do think we are in a perfect world.
Hmm.
I just think that our imperfections and I think that our imperfections coupled with the fact that we created society
Hmm.
makes the society itself imperfect, but the world itself, I do believe, is in perfect harmony,
Interesting.
despite our own individual influences on it.
So that's a really good topic for next time. Actually, perfection I think would be a really good idea to talk about. But to bounce off of that, um, I would say that if we were to connect this back to I forget which podcast we brought this up in, but it was Plato's
What
abstract
forms?
objects. right? The existence of abstract objects. Whereas like abstract objects are essentially, for anyone watching that might not remember, TR, how you doing? For anyone not remembering abstract objects or perhaps wasn't there for that podcast, abstract objects are essentially objects that may exist in the universe that are not physical, right? So this may be things like love or math, right? Math is a big one, or maybe even gravity. Some people might consider gravity as an abstract object. Whereas something like, a chair would be a non-abstract object because it's actually physical. Light, I think we brought this up when we talk about abstract object. Light is very interesting in that light has both properties of an abstract and non-abstract object. So if light exists and it displays properties of both abstract and non-abstract objects, that's why I believe abstract objects exist, because light has this sort of duality between being abstract and non-abstract. But I don't think every abstract object exists, right? Like, I think the idea of every abstract object exists. I just don't think every abstract object exists. Like, I don't know. It's like, one could argue love doesn't exist, but I'm not sure. Anyway, to not get too off topic here, let's see here. Perfection, abstract objects. Do you recall how I got into abstract objects? I was explaining it, but I forgot what got me into it.
I believe it was based on the statement of me believing that the world itself is perfect. However, we are not perfect, and in which case their society is not perfect.
I see. So yeah, I think perfection can exist as an abstract object, but because we aren't abstract objects, we can be imperfect in that sense. So in that way, I can believe in perfection. Just the way I see it is, I see perfection as an abstract object. That exists in the universe, is just not physical. But perfection is, strangely enough, the perfect idea for the next podcast, because I have a lot to say about perfection.
Agreed. That would make two of us.
Very nice.
The interesting part of it is that also could be what gets in, at least the way when I begin to define, what justice is, or even the existence of justice. My idea of justice could exist in a perfect, way.
Mm-hmm.
And anything less than said perfect way would not be justice based on my definition. And that could be the weeds that I'm tangled up in right now. Like, I could be tangled up in, not accepting the reality of justice being able to exist. It just doesn't exist the way that I believe it should exist, or in a perfect means.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's something that's interesting. It's funny how every topic we've ever discussed are all one and the same. They all kind of walk with each other hand in hand in one way, shape, or form.
Yeah, it definitely gives me more facets to sort of, I guess, dissect a subject, because I never thought I would be going into justice. I never thought I would relate it back to freedom. But it's a great way to talk about justice. It's a great way to describe the patterns I see when talking about justice, positive freedom in this case. I'm not sure how I could relate it to negative freedom, but if I had more time, if I had infinite time, I'm sure I'd be able to explain it all the way. But with the time I do have, with the time we have here on this podcast, I think we got a lot about justice covered. I feel like we made some good progress here.
I would agree. I mean, and to anyone out there that's listening, if there's something that you feel like we didn't touch on, or maybe got too lost in, let us know.
Definitely.
I know for me, when we have these conversations, it's because I am looking for whatever that ultimate truth is. And I do understand that one way or another you find it, through the expiration of life. And I have hopes of maybe if I can learn it 5 seconds before, that'd be great. Just be like, hey, I knew that, and now I'm out of existence.
Now,
yes, float on to something else.
Honestly, reaching enlightenment through streaming would obviously be very funny, and it would be the best. Just in the middle of one of these podcasts, I've reached enlightenment, and just see me, I just float off into the sky.
I've thought about that. And there are times where I feel like maybe not like the full-fledged enlightenment theory, but there have been times where I feel like the world just begins to make sense. And have you ever seen the movie Limitless, where the guy takes a pill and it unlocks his ability to, use more of his mind?
Oh, yeah. It's like, you only use 20% of your brain. It's like, use 100%, that one?
Correct.
Yeah, I've seen that movie.
I think about the ending, and it's he's able to predict the future based on probabilities
Hmm.
and what is the least or most likely case scenario to happen.
Hmm.
And there are times where you can kind of see that, just looking at the way the world's moving and the way it's going and the way things are taking place. And that moment of clarity, like as brief as they are, they're seconds,
Hmm.
but they do make you want to keep questioning and keep searching to obtain said knowledge. Because I mean, I don't see another reason for us to be here other than to grow, in one way, shape, or form.
Oh yeah. Whether that growth is limitless or not, we will have to see. Some people have posed the idea that technology does have a limit, but as far as we've seen, technology seems to just grow exponentially. So who knows whether we see that or not? Um, Let me see here. Was there anything else? I feel like I touched upon everything so far. Did you have any other burning comments, suggestions, anything like that?
The only thing would be a suggestion. I'd like us to eventually, and this is something I'll put together and work on,
Hmm.
cover the idea and the concept of artificial intelligence.
Oh yes, that's
Uh,
definitely something I have a lot to say about as well.
yeah, yeah, I think that'll be a good one, and I think it ties in with everything we've discussed, and it actually would kind of go hand in hand with perfectionism. So, yeah, I'd love an opportunity for us to openly discuss that,
Oh yeah,
and also
definitely.
get some feedback from the folks out there as well.
Oh yeah, definitely. There's honestly, before the advent of artificial intelligence, I thought it was just a fanciful sci-fi magic. I thought artificial intelligence was literally impossible, like time travel, right? It's like, oh, we're never gonna get time travel. It's just, sci-fi magic. But now that we actually have artificial intelligence, that's sort of the Pandora's box where suddenly it is no longer magic. It is within the realm of possibility and very much encroaching faster and faster every year. So I think conversations about artificial intelligence probably should have started a long time ago, but better late than never, I'd say.
Yeah, and I mean, one way or the other, whether it be for the good or for the detriment of human society, I mean, we're gonna get it one way or the other. So,
Hmm.
yeah,
It's coming. It can't hurt to talk about it. It can't hurt to talk about it.
agreed, agreed.
Um, but yeah, I have talked about everything I wanted to talk about. Seems like we have plans for our next podcast, perfection, and probably the inclusion of artificial intelligence as well. Assuming we can't get all of perfection in one podcast, we can double them up and get both. But other than that, yeah, that's everything I wanted to talk about.
Likewise here. And in closing, I'd like to say, because I am also recording this on my podcast, which is Civil Rhetoric, to everyone out there that took the time to listen to this discussion, I just really appreciate the fact that you did. This is not an easy concept to wrap your head around or to basically leave with such like it's a constant work in progress. So there's no way of saying that, oh, we have a definition we understand, and this is what justice or freedom or perfection or anything is. It's just the conversation in itself making the journey worthwhile. So, to everyone out there listening, thank you so much for taking the time. And I always enjoy an episode with you, Joey. I can't tell you how much I
Likewise.
look forward to these.
Yes, this is definitely probably the highlight of some of my streams, definitely. I've had a lot of memorable moments streaming. This is definitely one of them.
Agreed.
Hmm.
Agreed.
Well, I guess that will wrap it up here. Thank you everyone for joining, for coming to the podcast. We're definitely going to do another one of these. Um, but other than that, good night and take care.
Good night, everyone.
Bye bye.